Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to today's webinar. It's about 1 o'clock, and I see folks still calling in, so we're going to wait a couple of minutes here till everybody's on, and then we'll actually start. So stay put. I'll talk to you soon. Okay, well, good afternoon, folks. It's a little bit after 1. I think we have most of the folks who are coming already online, so let's get started with today's webinar. We're going to be talking about updating the Postal Service and the political chess game that's going on right now, which will give us a chance to talk about the Postal Service itself, what's going on, and what's going on outside the Postal Service. As you can see on the next slide here, we're going to cover a number of topics. We're going to cover volume and revenue, of course, operations, how that's being affected, what's going on legislatively or not, the outlook for the future, long and short term, and a summary of things about what you can do to keep yourself relatively informed as best you can over the next few weeks. So first of all, let's go on to the next slide to talk about volume and revenue. It's no shock that volume has gone down steadily since late March. The decline has varied from week to week, but it's been overall between 25 and 30%. And this has resulted in revenue at this point being $500 million below where the Postal Service's plan called for it to be. The latest numbers we've had for a week were those for last week, when volume was down overall over 28%. And as I said, that varies not only from week to week, but within total volume. For example, first-class mail, single piece, which is what consumers send, retail mail, was down almost 17%, but pre-sort, commercial mail, was down only 2%. Periodicals, oddly enough, was down really heavily, 38.7%. And marketing mail, where many of us rely upon for our livelihoods, was down very severely, almost 44% overall, but flats taking a hit of 37.4%. On the flip side, you've got a significant uptick in package volume as people who are at home now shop online, and that's resulted in business for both the Postal Service and its competitors. Packages are up 50% in the last full week, and they've been up every week by not the same amount, but well over 40% some weeks. So that's been a good thing, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Before I go any further, I want to make sure that you understand that there is a copy of the handouts that's available. You can see under the little box on your screens, there's a handout available that is today's slides. And also, if you have any questions during the course of the presentation, you can be sure to type the question in, and as best I can, I'll try to work it in as we go along here today. All right, continuing on, first-class mail, of course, the change there has been based upon the nature of what's being sent. There's less foot traffic, I'm sure, at post offices. There's less retail activity going on. People may be mailing fewer pieces than normal. They may be relying more on electronic media, unfortunately, continuing a trend that's been going on now for several years. But on the other side of first class, on the transactional side, the commercial side, you've got a lot of mailing activity that has to continue no matter what. You've got utility companies still sending out bills, for example, banks and credit cards still sending out their statements and bills. So there's a certain a certain continuity to the transactional side of first-class mail that you're going to see impacted relatively less than other parts of first class. Now, periodicals, it's surprising given the fact that periodicals are a subscription in most cases, and that everything is sent out on a schedule, and that there are relatively few copies being sent out that are discretionary, the samples and promotional copies and back issues and so forth. But yesterday, one of the callers on the webinar we had yesterday made a comment that they're having some subscribers contact them to ask that copies not be sent out during the current situation. And on a call with the Postal Service this morning, there was some surprise over that observation because other publishers have not reported any decline. So the reason why there's been a change as severely as we saw in periodicals still remains to be determined. The normal loss of periodicals volume from month to month is worse sometimes, usually worse, many times than the loss for other classes of mail. But still, seeing a decline to the scale that we saw a moment ago is exceptional and requires further investigation. Marketing mail, most of that, as I'm sure you can understand, is discretionary. And when you have the originator of the mail, whoever it is that's the purchaser of the postage, the initiator of the mailing, whether it's a retail outlet or a store or some other store or a restaurant or what have you, if they are closed or relying solely on limited access to customers, then you're not going to have them interested in sending out a lot of mail volume right now. There's no point in saying, come on in for a sale if we're closed. There's no point in coming in to say we're having a dinner special if we're not serving. So you see some result on that. Ironically, it's also something where if you happen to have an online presence, or if you happen to have some way to fulfill orders or deal with customers despite the lockdown, if you get your promotional pieces into the mailbox right now, you may have relatively little competition for the eyeballs of the consumer. So that's a different situation that's based upon the perceptions of the individual seller. Nonprofit mail. At one point, people were saying that nonprofit mail was not doing much. Others are saying just the opposite, that nonprofit activity is picking up because nonprofits not only have an ongoing need for support, but at this point, because of the demands being placed upon them by needy people, some are actually seeking more donations and are more active in mailing. So, as I mentioned at the top of the whole thing, what you're seeing is change, but is not a consistent level of change. You're seeing the variability in the patterns, variability in volume, variability in customer behavior. And of course, we talked about packages. The question for packages is not, where it's coming from. Obviously, we know why people are ordering. We know what's being ordered for the most part. But the question is whether or not what you're seeing is going to be a permanent situation once the stores reopen. Are people's behavior is going to maintain this pattern? Are they going to keep going to the store, or are they going to keep going online? That's something which is an open question to be determined later. The other part, of course, is operations. On the next slide, we talk about postal operations and how those are being affected. And the biggest impact, obviously, is going to be from absenteeism. And that, too, is variable based upon location. The hot spots at this point have been the New York area, metropolitan New York area, and the metropolitan Detroit area, where the NDCs and or PNDCs have experienced a higher than average, or certainly higher than normal level of absenteeism, and this has impacted their ability to process mail. As a result, you've got mail being offloaded to other facilities, and this is adding to transit time, adding to rehandlings. So if there are mailings involved that are at all time sensitive, then they may be experiencing undesirable late delivery. But if you don't have people to work the machines, to process the mail, to move the sacks, et cetera, there's not much you can do about it. So at least the mail is being processed, albeit through a roundabout direction, that's a circumstance being forced upon the Postal Service by the illness of some of its employees. Delivery for the most part is not affected. There is no national policy concerning mail curtailment or route curtailment. there is no instruction telling people to deliver just the first class of the periodicals, but not the standard mail. There is no such policy. What's actually being allowed is local decisions based upon individual experiences relating to illness, to absenteeism. There have been a few cases where retail outlets have had to close because people being out, but that's been a handful. I don't think it's ever exceeded a dozen, mostly small offices where you have few people. And there have been a similarly small number of situations where routes have had to be adjusted based upon absenteeism. There are some situations in the Michigan area where for a brief period of time there was every other day delivery because there weren't enough people to deliver every route every day. But that came and went. So even though delivery volume is down about 30%, which is understandable given the overall decrease in volume, you still got continuity of service, whether it's retail or delivery, with very isolated circumstances of less than full access, again, based upon absentee rates as those rise and fall. We have 3 calls a week with the Postal Service, and if anything stunning develops on those calls, we would let our subscribers know right away. But right now, operations are continuing as best they can. The next issue, of course, is legislative support on the next slide. And that's been probably the most disappointing and most concerning aspect of all of this. There have been, to this point, I believe, 4 different flavors of stimulus package that have passed Congress and been signed by the president, but nothing has been included that reflects direct aid to the Postal Service. We'll talk about talk about that further in a few minutes. But the only thing we saw was in the very first bill passed about a month or so ago, and that included authorization for the Postal Service to go further in debt. What a wonderful idea for an organization already drowning in red ink. And they authorized another $10 billion. Subsequently, nothing has been included, even though you've had pressure from the labor unions, pressure from the industry, pressure from the USPS, pressure from virtually everybody. But nothing has been included in the final versions. And the problem, the root cause of all this seems to be pretty obvious. It's at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, where there is a stubborn level of disinformation and lack of understanding that manifests itself in opposing any kind of help for the Postal Service. And of course, by extension, the Secretary of the Treasury is trying to attach conditions to the loan that was authorized. Last Friday, the comment was made during a signing ceremony for the most recent of the stimulus bills, at which the president said that he's not going to authorize Secretary Mnuchin to approve the loan until the Postal Service raises its rates for its package services by 4 or 5 times the current level. So that is, I don't think I'm being politically insensitive to say, an absurd thing to say. The Postal Service cannot just willy-nilly raise rates to ridiculous levels, even if it wanted to, because that would be commercially suicidal, first of all. But the whole issue of parcel rates keeps coming up, I think, for a couple of reasons, and they all kind of tie together. Last year, as you recall, there was a snit over the prices being paid for small packages coming in from China because they were fulfillment items for people, little gizmos you order. I want to get a special adapter for my cell phone, and you order it Amazon or whatever, and it comes in from China. And those packages were paying a lower rate based upon the pricing structure established by the Universal Postal Union, not the Postal Service. The rates they were paying was lower than what the same thing would cost for a domestic mailer. Long story short, that resulted in a bit of a kerfuffle with the Universal Postal Union that led to a change in how rates are set, so that in July of this year, the U.S. and many other countries will be able to establish self-declared rates and do a better job of making sure that the prices other countries pay for what's being sent internationally covers the costs that are experienced by the receiving post. Okay, that was one thing. And it was an issue that on which the White House had made quite a lot of noise. The Postal Service didn't react, I guess, in the appropriate fashion fast enough. And then we had the issue about Amazon and how they're not paying enough, allegedly. Well, Amazon is the focus of White House complaints and not Target or Walmart or anybody else who does online business, because the Washington Post, that is a frequent critic of the administration, is owned personally by Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos, of course, as you know, is the founder of Amazon. So when so you have this proxy issue going on now. The Postal Service is a proxy for Amazon, which is a proxy for Jeff Bezos. So you've got these demands being made on the pricing for Amazon parcels, even though it's clear, based upon the reviews of the Postal Regulatory Commission, that the package price is being charged to Amazon and all other similarly situated companies more than cover the costs that are associated and contribute nicely to the overall cost of the Postal Service. But those are facts, and we don't want to get facts in the way of our opinions. So all of this has led to a certain dissatisfaction with postal management. I guess Megan Brennan did not jump when she was told to jump. So now you've got a little, and somebody's nose is out of joint, and he's not going to let the Postal Service get any money until things are changed, until, it was a new PMG, or they can pick their PMG they want, or prices go up for Amazon sevenfold. Then that, I guess, will be okay. But that's the illogical situation that we're facing right now in terms of legislative support. Looking ahead, we can go to the next slide and see how that looks. It looks cloudy. We can't really tell an awful lot, except knowing that uncertainty is certain at this point. Looking further, we can look at volume and revenue, and we can see that the decline in mail volume is going to continue. We won't see the numbers for the first quarter of the calendar year, the second quarter of the Postal Service's fiscal year, until the end of next week. The governors are going to meet. The governors will look at the numbers, and then there will be the official release of Postal Quarter 2 numbers, excuse me, as well as numbers for the month of March. April, of course, will follow at some point in later on in May, and April will be the numbers that will really reflect the decline, because that was the month where things really hit badly. And at the end of the year, the Postal Service expects to see a volume that is as much as a half of what it was at the same point the year before. But in looking ahead, things look only minimally better. Referring to their experience that they had in the recession of 2008, 2009, when the permanent loss of volume was about 20%, they expect to see a somewhat larger loss of volume when things return to whatever we used to call normal after the pandemic is over. Now, I believe the annual volume would have been about 143 billion pieces. So take a quarter of that away, as well as the normal declines, and you're down in the 108, 110 range. And that's just not good. That's well below where you were 10 years ago, or 10, 12 years ago, I should say. The revenue impact, of course, is going to be serious. They expect to see a loss of 13 billion this year, and a 10-year loss of over $54 billion. Now, these numbers are coming from the PMG and a statement she made to the House subcommittee earlier in April. There have been questions raised about where these numbers came from. I suspect what they're doing is rolling forward some previously existing data. They're making some educated guesses, but clearly what they're doing is giving us their best estimate. They know that there is a cash flow problem. They go through a lot of money. They're a big company. They pay $2 billion every 2 weeks in payroll, and at this rate, they could conceivably run out of cash by the end of the fiscal year, unless some kind of help is provided. But even if they do get the 10 billion, unless things pick up a lot and there's a lot more money coming across the back dock or coming across the counter, they may be out of cash again by the end of April of next year. So, what do you do in this kind of situation? Well, the next slide shows you sort of the limitations they have when it comes to cost control. The Postal Service is a big company. I mean, and I mean physically big. You've got 32,000 postal retail outlets, depending what you want to count. And those that don't make any money, of course, are prohibited from closure. Every year in appropriations bills, there's a rider that Congress tacks on there saying that the Postal Service must continue 6-day delivery and cannot close post offices because they're unprofitable. So you've got a certain level of required infrastructure that cannot be adjusted despite a loss of business. And you've got service expectations. In 2012, they changed their service standards, and complaints about that are still continuing. So you are hardly able to reduce your service performance because it's expected, if not demanded by Congress. Then you've got labor. I mean, you've got a lot of people working there. And the way that the contracts with the labor unions are set up, they're guaranteed against layoff. Now, if you look back into the 70s and 80s when mail just happened, when volume was growing every year by nice amounts, the Postal Service probably figured, why not? It's a pretty nice thing to guarantee people that they'll have their jobs as long as they want. But you look back now and say, maybe it wasn't such a smart idea, because now if you've got a circumstance where you've got limits on layoff, prohibitions on layoff, you've got limitations on the use of part-time or non-career workers, and you've got other guaranteed costs like raises and cost of living adjustments. You've got bans on crossing crafts. Suddenly you realize that the Postal Service has tied its hands pretty badly in terms of flexibility. Now, if you've got an organization that needs 200 some odd thousand people delivering mail every day, but you've got another number of people who are employed in processing facilities, it might make sense if those who were underemployed processing mail could go out and help deliver the mail on the routes, because the number of delivery stops is not going down. The number of places to bring mail is going up, even though the number of pieces going to those places is going down and the value of that mail is going down. But the way that the contracts are structured, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult, especially on a short-term basis, to say, hey you clerk, I need to have somebody covering Route 7 today. Could you do that? Because we got all these carriers out sick, and that's just not feasible. So that's a limitation. It's a problem, and it's a cost factor. A good number of 75-80%, depending what you want to count, of postal costs are tied to people. And if you can't manage your workforce in a way that is effective, that is useful to you, then that's a real problem. Whether or not you can argue about everything else about contracts and so forth, but the fact is that if you've got employees who are not able to enable achievement of the employer's mission, then that's a problem, and it's a problem that affects everybody. That everybody should realize that it isn't a union and management issue. And then you've got pricing. You can't just jack up prices at a point like this to cover additional costs, because if you're losing business anyways, it's totally against business sense to raise prices. By the same token, you've got issues with rate setting classification rules that inhibit price reductions. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, a little more in depth. But look at the next thing we want to look at, then of course, on the next slide is legislative issues. And then, there are still requests for direct aid. As you can see on the slide there, the governors of the Postal Service unanimously supported a message by the PMG that she delivered in early April to the House subcommittee. And as I mentioned before, you've got everybody's in this. The media is supporting the Postal Service, the unions, the industry. Everybody is out there saying the same thing. And the postal, help the Postal Service. Don't stand by and watch it crumble. Here's in a way, there's a problem with this request. You have $89 billion, which is a decent amount of money. And that's more than the Postal Service makes in a year. $25 billion in direct aid to offset losses. Okay, so you can pretty much figure that can be documented fairly clearly. $25 billion more in modernization grant, and that's going to go towards new trucks, for example, getting rid of the inflammable LLVs. and $39 billion, which is a combination of forgiving about $14 billion in current loans and giving new authority to borrow another $25 billion. So you've got all of those numbers out there. They've been criticized because they were nice round numbers and didn't have an awful lot of supporting documentation. But whether it's $24.6 billion or $25.1 billion, the fact of the matter is that there is a substantial amount of money needed to cover the current losses. They need to have money to do capital improvements that have not gone on for years. And they've got to be able to borrow money without having all kinds of strings attached. The worrisome thing was, as the PMG said, all of this is based upon some current assumptions and projections, but those may not be the worst case. And if there is a worst case beyond this, then we've really got a problem. But of course, we'll have to cross that bridge, which I hope we don't have to in the future. None of this, as you will know, affects the other long-term issues. This does not deal with the so-called post-reform issues that have been discussed in the past. There's nothing to do with the pre-funding obligation. There's nothing to do with Medicare integration. And there's nothing to do with the pricing flexibility the Postal Service wants, or the essentially outdated business model it has, where you have to provide universal service without a guarantee of having some sort of funding for the expenses that universal service represents. So a lot of those things just aren't being covered by the immediate need for additional funds. Now, the next thing we look at is commercial mailers. How are they being affected by all this? And how is the regulatory picture changing? Well, on the second thing first, you've got some short-term questions about how DMM rules and so forth apply, or how they will apply. On today's conversation with the Postal Service, we were told there is a policy statement coming out probably this week that talks about how the Postal Service will deal with some of the issues caused by mailings that have been delayed. If you're a commercial mail producer and you had a mailing that was readied by, you got ready by the Smith department store, and now all of a sudden Smith calls out and says, hold it. Well, if you hold it long enough, it's going to be out of date. It's the mailing list, the labeling list that were used, the pre-sort will be outdated. You may have issues with move update. You may have issues with the undocumented mail, or you may have issues with a number of compliance things, unique barcodes, for example. So all of those things, which the Postal Service really didn't entirely capture at first. They weren't really thinking about this, but it's all been brought to their attention, and they're preparing a document now to say what the policy will be going forward, so that the scorecard is not hurt. You don't have to have fines imposed and all that kind of thing. The talk was allowing this to cover a period probably through the end of June, but we'll see what the actual dates are when they get finished. The issue of rate reduction, there was a lot of buzz on social media, for example, a couple weeks ago about, we need a rate reduction. And the idea of reducing rates or having a promotion was something that we supported, because in principle it's something that would make sense. But looking further, there are some practical issues to it that really people needed to understand. The Postal Service ultimately came back and said, no, we thought about it, but we can't do it. And looking at it, of course, is both emotional and practical. You'd like to be able to go back to your clients and say, we've got a X amount rate reduction from the Postal Service if you do X, Y, Z. That would be great. It would help to both engage mailing clients and keep the lights on at our mailing companies. But the practical issue is narrowing down who to help, how, and why, and when. Obviously, if you're going to help mailers, not all mailers need help. Not all ratepayers need help. You may have small businesses for whom mailing is a big expense and for whom it's discretionary, and you may want to help them. But you don't need to help the electric company. They're going to mail their bills out no matter what. The same would hold for those who are sending a lot of transactional mail based upon statements and whatnot. And then even within a certain community of mailers, retailers, let's say, how do you have an allowance that is not unduly discriminatory? And here's where the lawyers get involved. The lawyers get all nervous. The next thing would be, okay, we figured out who to give it to, how much do we give, and for how long. And then that brings in two legitimate questions. The first is, what's in it for me? I give you a discount to mail. There are already promotions and incentives, but I give you another one to get back into the mail. How long are you going to stay? How much more are you going to mail? Are you going to date me but not ever marry me? Are you going to continue to mail after the incentive is gone? And internally, and for that matter, to the PRC and to Congress, how can we, on one side, how can the Postal Service, on the one hand, offer these reductions in revenue, temporary perhaps, and while the next breath saying, gee, we're going broke, we need money. So there are some practical issues here that kind of totally kill the idea of a rate discount for ratepayers. Then there was the PRC process. The law does not have a provision for stimulus. There is no way to say, oh, it's okay, we know it's a good reason. No. You're still going to maintain cost coverage, and some types of mail, some categories of standard mail, some categories of flats in general, heaven knows periodicals, are just simply nowhere near covering their costs. So the PRC cannot ignore that. Cost coverage is statutory. And proposals that would come from the Postal Service would have to be able to be accepted within the law. When the letter went from the industry to the PMG and to the chairman of the PRC asking for some sort of rate relief, the answer came back from the Rate Commission that afternoon and said, oh, thank you for this. We'd be happy to consider anything that's given to us that complies with existing law, which doesn't tell you anything will be different. In other words, they can say, you can ask whatever you want to ask for, but it's going to have to meet conditions of the law. If it doesn't, we're not going to approve it. So he said, otherwise, thank you, have a nice day. So there's not much outlook there as far as a price break goes beyond the incentives and promotions that are already permitted by the Postal Service. So now, going back to where I started there on commercial mailers in the next slide, this is just not a pretty picture, and there's no way to make it pretty. There's going to be a lot of pressure continuing because clients are going to go away. The clients, as we may be finding ways to shop differently and communicate differently, they may be finding ways to contact clients differently, contact their customers differently. So you're going to see some customers, some clients, that is, drifting off or mailing less. You're going to see them having decreased advertising budgets, and you don't know how much of the budget was going to go towards mail. So there's going to be a problem right there. As far as companies themselves go, aside from their clients' activities, their survivability is going to be based upon a number of factors. What was your condition in January? What was the condition of the company then? Were you a strong company? Were you highly leveraged? Did you have access to capital? Did the bank like you? What's your operational flexibility? Did you have just one line of business? Did you not have any ancillary services that were profitable? And what's your diversification? Did you have a big client or two on whom you relied? Or did you have a nice big portfolio of people who could come and go, who could more or less balance each other out as their individual business needs changed? What was your plan? What was your cash management practices? How had you prepared for a rainy day? This, of course, is the 100-year flood we're coming up right now. But the companies who were smartly, tightly, wisely managed, who didn't get too far out on a limb, are the ones who are going to probably do better than those who were overextended or who were not doing well to start with. In the recession, I recall back in the association days, member companies would close because their single big client pulled their business, or because they were a well-run company whose bank was sold and the purchasing bank called the line of credit. I mean, there are some things that are unforeseeable. You can't plan for everything, but within the framework and options of a commercial mailer, how many come out the other side of this still alive and well is going to be based upon the condition that they were in when they went into this. So that's sort of the way this is going to look. But I'm sure we're going to see some contraction going forward. So next page, just going to summaries of where we are. You can expect to see the downhill slide continuing into the summer, probably not picking up until late summer or fall, and then stabilizing next year, but at a lower level than what we've seen even in the recent past. The financial situation is going to stay critical. The Postal Service gets criticized for crying wolf a lot. The other side of that coin is saying that they're being honest and keeping everybody aware of their financial situation, which doesn't change. So they're not crying wolf. They're just saying the same thing over and over again. People aren't listening. And even so, there's no hope at this point unless the White House suddenly wakes up and understands the facts. There's not much chance for legislative relief. On the conversation, the call this morning, an important point was made that I hope all of you take to heart, and that is that legislators in Congress do react to voters. They have to, because they're the ones that put them there. So if your companies individually write to representatives in Congress, senators and representatives, explaining the economic significance of your company, explaining the number of employees you have who vote and their economic value, then that might make a difference. The Envelope Manufacturers Association has an annual survey. It's www.envelope.org, and it's right there and available for you, that shows by state, excuse me, the number of jobs tied to mailing activity, not Postal Service jobs but mailing industry jobs. And it's the value of the industry in total is well over $1 trillion. And there are 7 million people who work in some part of the industry. So I would urge you to use this information to contact the folks in Congress, so that at least they'll have something that informs them a little bit better than what they're hearing from the other end of the street. Meanwhile, of course, you've got the Postal Service sitting there unable to right-size its infrastructure to what it needs to be, at least for the short term, and also trying to do the best it can to accommodate the needs of customers during this period. Even though there are delays because of illness, it cannot cut prices, as we said, and there will very well be contraction over the long term in the industry because of all of this. So, closing thoughts on the next slide. That there are places to get information that you need to really rely upon. Of course, the Postal Service has industry alerts and DMM advisories. We provide information on our website. We have a COVID-19 page that is dedicated to these announcements. But also we have our newsletter every 2 weeks, in which we try to cram every single piece of information that would be needed by a commercial mailer at times like this. So we would encourage those of you who are subscribers to use those resources to your advantage. And if you're not a subscriber, heaven knows, we welcome you if you'd like to become one. Last thoughts, I guess, on the next slide, they got a little illustration that in a chess game, the players sacrifice the pawns to protect their most important pieces. But in the political chess game, the players sacrifice the pawns to serve their own purposes. So, who are the pawns in this game? Well, I think we know at this point exactly who the pawns are, because they're the ones who are being batted back and forth without much regard for their own values and needs. So to serve the needs and interests of those who are on the opposite ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. But that's my opinion. I could be wrong. If you have any questions right now, you can see there's how to contact us if you have any questions or want more information. You will be getting a little note after the webinar asking you for any thoughts about what we did today, for your thoughts about what you'd like to have in future webinars. And you can, of course, contact us for any further information. We have a webinar every month, and our next webinar coming up in May, I believe, is going to be, I can't think of the date off the top of my head, but it's going to be on the CCPA and the California Consumer Price Law and Consumer Protection Act, rather, and that's going to be something that's going to affect all of us, and it has affected all of us. So it's kind of an update on that topic. So before we do anything else, I don't see any questions right now in the question box. So if there are any that you have later on, please feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I want to thank Michelle for making sure that everything worked today. She's doing the work in the background here. And I want to thank all of you for calling in. As I say, we have webinars coming up there, www.mailershubwebinars.com is where to sign up for them. And we look forward to seeing you on another webinar in the future. Thanks again for calling today. Stay safe. Take care. Talk to you later. Bye.